So what if American politics isn't really about Democrats versus Republicans anymore? What if it's something much bigger, like a fight for the very soul of the nation? Well, that's the provocative argument at the heart of Newt Gingrich's book, Trump and the American Future. And in this explainer, we're going to break down its core ideas for you.
And really, this one quote, it just sets the tone for the entire book. We're not talking about small policy tweaks or, typical political maneuvering. The perspective here frames the whole thing as a super high-stakes battle for the country's survival. The idea is that if one side wins, the other side's values, well, they're just extinguished.
So this really gets to the central thesis of the book, that politics has become a life-or-death war over what it even means to be American. To really get our heads around this argument, we're going to explore the three key battlegrounds that the author lays out. First, the fight for law and order. Then, the clash over America's future policies. And finally, the external threat from China.
Okay, let's dive into that first pillar, law and order. From the author's point of view, there's been a really dangerous shift in how we approach justice, and honestly, a huge chunk of the book is dedicated to this very topic.
So you might have heard this term, sanctuary jurisdiction. But what does it actually mean, according to the book? Well, the source defines it as a policy that basically ties the hands of local police, stopping them from working with federal immigration agents like ICE. And the core claim here is that this directly puts citizens at risk.
And the book doesn't just talk in vague terms. It points to really specific policies that it calls pro-criminal. Things like the no-bail movement, where defendants get released before trial without posting any bond. Or it points to a decision in Dallas not to prosecute certain thefts. The argument is that these aren't just isolated incidents. They're all part of a bigger, deliberate trend to weaken law enforcement.
And this is where the argument really tries to hit home, to make it personal. It moves away from just policy debates to tell the story of Maria Fuertes. The point the author is making is that these policies aren't abstract. They have tragic, real-world consequences. And stories like this, it argues, represent the human cost when federal immigration requests are ignored.
But the argument doesn't just stop with crime. It claims there's a much wider cultural battle going on, and this one is over free speech. The book uses this interesting phrase, intolerant tolerance, to describe what it sees as this kind of paradox, an attempt to shut down any conversation or viewpoint that doesn't fit into one very specific worldview. Okay, so if that's the diagnosis of the problem, what's the proposed solution? That brings us right to our second pillar, the vision for America's future. And this is where we're going to see a really direct contrast in policies, covering everything from healthcare and the economy to the environment.
Let's take healthcare. The book presents a really stark choice. On one hand, you have government-run systems, which it argues lead to long waits and a ton of bureaucratic red tape. But on the other hand, you have private sector solutions, which the book claims are way more innovative and can adapt super quickly in a crisis, something it says was really tested during the COVID-19 pandemic.
And the economy? Well, the argument here is pretty simple. The policies that were in place right before the pandemic, they were working. And the proof, according to the author, is right there in the numbers. Specifically, it points to the record low unemployment rates for African American, Latino, and Asian Americans as the ultimate evidence of that success.
Now for the environment. The vision laid out here is framed as being less about regulation and way more about innovation. It's pitched as a kind of entrepreneurial approach that focuses on these big, bold ideas. We're talking planting 1 trillion trees, investing in nuclear power and carbon capture, and actively managing our forests to stop wildfires before they start.
All right, so we've looked at the battles happening inside the country. But what about threats from the outside? That brings us to our third and final pillar, where the focus gets laser sharp and zeroes in on one country as America's single biggest challenge.
And the book is crystal clear on this point. China isn't just a competitor, it's presented as an existential threat. The whole argument is that the goals of the Chinese Communist Party are just fundamentally at odds with American values, and because of that, it poses a direct danger to our national security.
The prime example used to really illustrate this threat, the COVID-19 pandemic. The book lays out a specific timeline, alleging a cover-up that it says started with the silencing of doctors, like Dr. Li Wenliang, who were trying to sound the alarm. The central claim here is that this one act of suppression is exactly what allowed a local outbreak to explode into a global catastrophe.
But the book argues that the threat from China is so much broader than just the pandemic. It points to a whole range of different areas where the Chinese Communist Party is allegedly working against American interests. I mean, everything from global propaganda and tech competition with Huawei to military expansion and systemic human rights abuses.
Okay, so how do all these different pieces, the internal struggles, the external threats, how do they all fit together? Let's get to the book's final argument, which really ties the domestic and foreign policy threads into one big, overarching narrative.
And here is the big takeaway from the book. The argument is that these are not separate issues at all. The fight against what it calls domestic radicalism and the fight against foreign authoritarianism, well, they're presented as two fronts in the exact same war, a war for America's future.
And this final quote, man, it really brings it all home. The author is not talking about some temporary political squabble here. The perspective is that this is the defining conflict of our time, the one that's going to shape the country for a whole generation to come.
So as we've seen, this book makes a really powerful case for a specific worldview, one that frames politics as this all-or-nothing battle for survival. And that leaves us with a pretty critical question to think about. When the stakes are presented as being this high, what happens to the space for dialogue, for compromise, for just finding common ground?